So, for the better part of the last decade, building a software company felt a lot like building a race car in a residential garage.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was like.
Right, you bolt the absolute biggest engine you can afford onto the lightest possible chassis, you roll it out onto a public street, and just floor the accelerator.
And if a piece of the bodywork flies off at 100 miles an hour,
Uh,
you don't pull over,
no, you definitely don't pull over. You just lean out the window and duct tape it back on while you're driving.
which is wild when you think about it now.
It is wild. But the entire industry championed this. We literally called it the move fast and break things era. The market rewarded speed above all else.
Right, because the permissionless innovation was just the default state of the tech world. The underlying assumption was always that, well, software is malleable.
Exactly.
If a feature hallucinates or database integration leaks, you just push a patch in the next sprint.
Yeah.
The consequences of broken software were largely confined to poor user experience or maybe temporary service outages.
But imagine waking up this morning, right? You walk out to your garage and you find it surrounded by federal inspectors, state troopers, and international auditors.
Not looking at your speed anymore.
Not at all. They're demanding a crash test ratings. They want emissions reports. They want a metallurgical breakdown of every single bolt inside that engine before they even allow you to put the key in the ignition.
The era of duct tape is definitively over.
It is over. Welcome to Sunday, May 10th, 2026. If you are building, buying, or selling software right now, you need to understand that this week marks a point of no return.
We have officially entered what the industry is calling the 2026 AI regulatory supercycle.
Which is just a massive term.
It is, but it's accurate. The paradigm has entirely inverted. We are transitioning from unbridled, consequence-free artificial intelligence experimentation to an era of rigid, enforceable, and frankly, technically complex accountability.
And the challenge for anyone writing code or running a business is that this transition is happening across multiple jurisdictions simultaneously.
Often with completely contradictory mandates.
Right, which is the core mission of our deep dive today. This conversation is designed as your definitive survival guide. We're calling it the 2026 AI Regulatory Supercycle, a survival guide for SaaS founders.
I like the title.
Thanks. Because whether you are a startup founder trying to close a Series A, an enterprise tech buyer terrified of auditing your vendors, or just an insanely curious learner trying to map out the future of technology, we are going to unpack exactly how the rules of SaaS accountability are being rewritten from the ground up.
Man, we have a lot of ground to cover.
We really do. We're covering the new FDA for algorithms proposed in the US, the ticking 90-day countdown for the EU AI Act, the intense political showdowns between federal and state governments, and a rise of autonomous agents in places like Singapore.
Just to quickly interject before we really get into the weeds here, because we are going to be discussing some highly charged political battles over regulation today.
Oh yeah, definitely need to mention that.
Right. Including conflicts between the Trump administration and various state governments. We need to be clear to everyone listening that we take no political sides here.
Zero.
Our mission is purely to impartially report on the legal realities and their operational impacts based on the provided sources.
Exactly. We are just giving you the facts on the ground. And the stakes here, they require immediate attention.
The financial implications are no longer theoretical.
Because current projections indicate that ungoverned AI is going to cost B2B companies over $10 billion in 2026 alone.
Yeah.
I need to pause on that number, though. $10 billion. That sounds like a gross exaggeration of, potential fines.
See, that's the misconception. Fines are actually a really minor fraction of that calculation.
Wait, really?
Yeah, that $10 billion figure represents the friction of a market that has suddenly lost trust in its own infrastructure.
Oh, I see.
It accounts for enterprise pilot programs that are currently stalled in procurement purgatory. It accounts for massive SaaS deals that are dying in the final stages because the vendor simply cannot mathematically prove to the buyer that their AI is secure and compliant.
Right, they can't show their work.
Exactly. It includes the skyrocketing costs of delayed product launches while legal teams try to interpret these brand new mandates. If your software lacks a robust, auditable AI governance framework right now, it is rapidly becoming unsellable to the enterprise market.
Unsellable. That is a terrifying word for a founder.
It is.
So if you're sitting there looking at your product roadmap right now, wondering why everything suddenly feels so heavy, We need to trace this back to the catalyst.
To the moment everything changed.
Right, because before we can understand why regulators from Washington to Brussels are suddenly acting like we're in the middle of a five-alarm national security crisis, we have to look at how the technology itself just shattered a very specific, terrifying barrier.
We need to talk about Anthropic's Claude Mythos preview.
Yes, which dropped last month in April 2026.
Mythos is the undeniable inflection point for the supercycle we're discussing today.
Because on its public specification sheet, Mythos is simply the next iteration of a general-purpose large language model, right?
Right, but during its internal and third-party red teaming phases, researchers discovered something unprecedented. Mythos excels, to a highly sophisticated degree, at autonomous cybersecurity exploitation.
And the crucial context here is that Anthropic didn't intentionally train it to be a master hacker.
No, not at all.
They didn't feed it a strict diet of malware code and tell it to go break things. The offensive security capabilities just emerged organically.
Yeah, as a byproduct of the model getting vastly better at generalized reasoning, logic puzzles, and understanding complex systems.
And the verified case studies are absolutely wild. We aren't talking about an AI writing a slightly more convincing phishing email.
No, we are talking about an AI autonomously hunting down and exploiting a 27-year-old bug in OpenBSD.
Which is insane.
The OpenBSD case study fundamentally altered the threat landscape because OpenBSD is an operating system renowned globally for its intense focus on proactive security and cryptography.
Right, it is not an easy target.
Exactly. Yet Mythos autonomously identified a vulnerability in the operating system's implementation of selective acknowledgement for TCP that had been sitting dormant since 1998.
Wow.
The model realized it could chain a missing range check with a signed integer overflow on 32-bit sequence numbers. By doing so, it caused the kernel to write through a NOL pointer, crashing the machine entirely.
Okay, wait, let me stop you right there.
Sure.
I'm putting myself in the shoes of a sauce founder building, like a marketing automation platform or a logistics tool. I am not a penetration tester.
Fair enough.
You just threw out selective acknowledgement, signed integer overflow, and NLL pointer. What is the model actually doing mechanically? Translate that into plain English for us.
Okay, think of TCP, the Transmission Control Protocol, as the postal service of the internet.
Okay, postal service. Got it.
When data is sent across the web, it gets broken down into smaller packages. Selective acknowledgement is simply the receiving computer telling the sender, I received packages 1, 2, and 4, but I'm missing package 3, so please resend it.
Makes sense.
To keep track of these billions of packages, the system numbers them. But computers have limits on how high they can count based on their memory architecture.
Right.
Assigned integer overflow happens when the package number gets so high that the computer's counter essentially breaks, rolls over, and suddenly registers as a negative number.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So Mythos figured out that because the 1998 codes lacked a range check, which is just a simple rule verifying the number wasn't negative, it could force the system to look for a package at a negative memory address, which doesn't exist.
And that's the NLL pointer.
That is the NLL pointer. The computer gets so confused looking for something that cannot physically exist that the entire operating system panics and shuts down.
So an AI, sitting alone in a server farm somewhere, reasoned through the logic of an internet postal service, realized the 1998 developers forgot to check if a number could turn negative, and used that mathematical quirk to instantly kill a secure server.
Autonomously.
That is
With no human prompting, beyond the initial instruction to find vulnerabilities.
And the economics of this are what really keep me up at night. The single automated run that surfaced and exploited this 27-year-old bug cost under $50 in API compute spend.
Which is nothing.
$50. Hiring a human red team of elite hackers to scour an operating system for weeks would cost tens of thousands of dollars.
Easily.
And it also didn't stop there. It found a 17-year-old remote code execution flaw in FreeBSD. I think it was logged as CVE 2026-4747.
Okay.
And the way it exploited that one was by autonomously splitting a 20-gadget return-oriented programming chain across 6 sequential packets.
Right. Return-oriented programming, or ROP, is another concept that really highlights the model's advanced reasoning.
How so?
Well, modern computer systems have defenses that prevent attackers from just inserting malicious code and running it. So instead of bringing its own weapons, Mythos used an ROP chain.
Okay.
It searched through the code that was already legally running on the computer, found tiny harmless snippets of instructions scattered all over the place, and chained them together in a specific sequence to achieve its goal.
It's like cutting letters out of a magazine to write a ransom note so your handwriting isn't recognized.
That is a highly accurate comparison, actually. It gathered those existing snippets, split them across 6 separate network packets to sneak past a firewall size limit, reassembled them inside the target machine, and used them to append an SSH key.
Oh,
Yeah,
man.
that gave the AI full remote root access to the server, complete control. It even chained multiple vulnerabilities together to systematically defeat Linux kernel protections.
Which brings us to the independent evaluation by the UK's AI Security Institute, the AISI, because they got their hands on Mythos to see just how bad this really is.
And their conclusion is a massive wake-up call for anyone maintaining a codebase.
Yeah, they essentially found that if you are a massive bank with hardened, actively defended systems, layered tooling, zero trust architecture, Mythos might struggle to get through.
Might.
Right, might. But if you are running poorly defended, unpatched legacy software, Mythos will tear through it like tissue paper.
The grim reality of the enterprise software world is that the vast majority of critical infrastructure runs on a mountain of technical debt and unpatched legacy code.
Everyone has legacy code.
Exactly. The AISI report documented that Mythos completed complex, multi-step infiltration scenarios that no prior AI model had ever successfully navigated. It achieved an unprecedented 73% success rate on expert-level cybersecurity, capture the flag challenges.
Wow.
But the defining insight from the ASI, the realization that absolutely terrified international regulators, is that the window between vulnerability disclosure and active exploitation has officially collapsed to zero.
Explain that window for me.
Historically, when a security researcher discovers a flaw and publishes a CVE, a common vulnerabilities and exposures identifier, there is a race.
Right.
The software vendor races to write a patch, and system administrators race to install it. Meanwhile, malicious hackers race to read the CVE, figure out how the vulnerability works, write a custom exploit, and attack systems before they are patched.
Which takes time.
Right, that human process usually takes days or weeks.
Hmm.
But with a model like Mythos, the moment a vulnerability is publicly detailed, the AI can digest the documentation and generate a functional, automated exploit script in minutes. Human patch cycles physically cannot move fast enough to defend against machine speed exploitation.
As Anthropic looks at what they've created, they realize they've essentially manifested a highly scalable cyber weapon, and they make a massive business decision. They decide not to release the Mythos model to the public.
Right.
Instead, they lock it behind a highly restricted gated access program called Project Glasswing.
Project Glasswing represents a fascinating shift in AI deployment strategy. Anthropic limited access to roughly 12 elite launch partners.
We're talking massive companies.
Massive. Companies with massive infrastructure footprints like AWS, Apple, Cisco, Microsoft, NVIDIA, and CrowdStrike, along with about 40 heavily vetted critical infrastructure organizations.
And the terms are strict, right?
Very. The terms of service within Project Glasswing strictly mandate that the model can only be used for defensive cybersecurity posture management and patching. It is an entirely closed ecosystem.
Okay, but you're saying Anthropic locked this up for safety. Isn't that just a highly convenient excuse for regulatory capture?
It's a hotly debated point.
I mean, if I'm a mid-market cybersecurity startup or a SaaS company trying to build innovative defensive tools for my clients, Anthropic just kneecapped my ability to compete. They handed a master lockpicker a map to every unlocked window in the world, but they only gave the map to a cartel of trillion-dollar tech giants. Does Project Glasswing actually keep the internet safe, or does it just cement a monopoly under the guise of national security?
Like I said, the cybersecurity community is bitterly divided over this exact dynamic.
I can imagine.
The core argument defending Anthropic is triage, right? Limiting access drastically reduces the probability of malicious actors using Mythos to launch catastrophic automated attacks before the global ecosystem can harden its defenses.
Sure.
But the counter-argument, championed by open-source advocates and mid-market vendors, is the problem of asymmetry.
Right.
Because Mythos is kept out of the public domain, independent security researchers cannot interrogate its weights, verify its true capabilities, or build open-source countermeasures.
Which means they're flying blind.
Completely blind. If you are that mid-market SaaS provider, you cannot use Mythos to scan your own code for that 27-year-old bug. But you must operate under the assumption that state-sponsored threat actors will soon develop or steal similar capabilities.
Yeah.
You are being forced to defend your software against an unknown unknown.
And it's that exact terror, the specter of autonomous machine speed hacking, taking down power grids or banking systems, That brings us to the profound regulatory pivot happening in the United States right now.
The panic in Washington is palpable.
Oh, absolutely. Because the capabilities of Mythos forced the U.S. federal government into an absolute panic, which triggered a massive shift away from the previous voluntary safety commitments and straight into mandatory federal oversight.
Yes.
We are looking at the birth of an FDA for algorithms.
On May 6, 2026, the White House introduced a sweeping proposal to establish a formalized mandatory vetting system for all new frontier AI models.
And they used that exact FDA analogy, didn't they?
They did. Kevin Hassett, the director of the National Economic Council, was incredibly deliberate in his messaging. He explicitly compared this new framework to the Food and Drug Administration's drug approval pipeline. The administration's stance is now that before any high-capability foundation model can be released into the wild, whether open source or via API, it must be subjected to rigorous government-mandated stress tests.
Test it left and right.
Exactly. It must be tested from every conceivable angle to definitively prove it cannot cause catastrophic harm to American critical infrastructure or economic interests.
What makes this so jarring, honestly, is the political whiplash.
Oh, the reversal is historic.
Because the Trump administration entered office with a fiercely deregulatory agenda. Literally on day one, January 20th, 2025, one of their first actions was revoking President Biden's executive order 14110.
Right.
And that was the Biden order that required major AI companies to share their safety testing and red teaming results with the federal government. The initial Trump mandate was to strip away the red tape, remove barriers, and ensure American dominance in the AI arms race against China.
The deregulatory philosophy held strong until the theoretical risks of AI became undeniable, demonstrable realities.
Like Mythos.
Exactly. When intelligence briefings and independent reports confirmed that models approaching the capability of Mythos could autonomously compromise legacy systems at scale, calculus changed overnight.
It had to.
Hassett described the May 6th pivot as a scrambled all-of-government effort. It signifies a fundamental realization in Washington. Frontier AI is no longer viewed simply as a software application or a productivity tool.
No.
It is being classified as a dual-use technology with profound immediate national security implications. And you do not deregulate dual-use weapons technology.
Okay, let's follow that FDA clinical trials analogy all the way down the sauce supply chain, because this is where the survival guide aspect of this deep dive kicks in.
Let's do it.
Getting a new pharmaceutical drug through phase 1, 2, and 3 FDA trials takes years and requires hundreds of millions of dollars in capital.
It does.
If only massive legacy pharmaceutical companies can afford the cost of an FDA trial, won't an FDA for algorithms fundamentally crush startup innovation?
That is the central anxiety paralyzing venture capital markets this week. The immediate target of this proposed vetting system is, of course, the foundation model developers, the Anthropics, the OpenAIs, the Googles.
The ones with the money.
Right. They have the billions required to navigate a pre-market approval regime. But the software industry operates as a deeply interconnected supply chain.
Exactly.
A SaaS company rarely trains a foundational model from scratch. They license a foundation model and fine-tune it with their proprietary enterprise data.
Right. So if I'm a SaaS founder building a specialized legal tech platform, and I license an open source model that has already passed its federal vetting, but then I fine-tune it on a massive database of confidential legal contracts to make it better at writing legal briefs.
Okay.
Do I trigger a brand new federal vetting requirement? Have I created a new model in the eyes of the government?
The current proposals are terrifyingly ambiguous on this exact point.
That's not what founders want to hear.
No, but it's the reality. The working assumption among legal scholars is that liability and compliance obligations will cascade down the supply chain.
Ouch.
If you significantly alter the weights or capabilities of a vetted model through fine-tuning, you may be required to prove that your specific implementation hasn't reintroduced the very vulnerabilities the federal test was designed to eliminate.
Which means more delays.
Massive delays. The operational consequence is that the time to market for high-capability AI features is going to expand drastically. We are entering an era of regulatory purgatory.
Wow.
Instead of pushing a new AI feature to production on a Friday afternoon, that feature might sit in a compliance queue for 6 months while federal agencies assess its risk profile. The era of permissionless innovation is dead. It is being replaced by a gated, heavily coordinated safety framework.
So if the federal government is frantically trying to build this massive, unyielding gate for the most advanced frontier models, you'd think that's the only thing founders have to worry about.
If only it were that simple.
But it's not, because while Washington is focused on national security and autonomous hacking, individual state governments have been aggressively policing how everyday, mundane AI is used right now in local businesses.
Yes.
And this is creating an absolute legal collision. Let's dig into the great federal-state showdown.
The fiction here stems from a massive legislative vacuum. Over the past few years, the federal government failed to pass comprehensive nationwide AI legislation regarding civil rights, privacy, and consumer protection.
And nature abhors a vacuum.
And so do state legislatures.
Yeah.
In 2025 alone, we tracked over 1,000 distinct AI-related bills introduced across state capitals.
1,000.
Over 1,000. We ended up with a fractured, highly contradictory patchwork of state-level compliance mandates. To counter this chaos, President Trump signed Executive Order 1365 in December 2025.
Right, I remember that.
The explicit goal of that order was to preempt state AI laws and establish a minimally burdensome national standard.
Because the administration's argument is purely economic, right? If a SaaS startup in Ohio has to write 50 different variations of its code base to comply with 50 different state definitions of algorithmic fairness, that startup dies. It's impossible.
It is functionally impossible for a small team.
So to enforce this national standard, the Department of Justice established an AI litigation task force in January 2026, spearheaded by former Attorney General Pam Bondi.
Yes.
Their mandate is to aggressively challenge state laws in federal court that the administration deems onerous or detrimental to American innovation.
And the DOJ isn't just relying on courtroom litigation. They're deploying massive financial leverage.
The broadband money.
Exactly. The executive order instructs the Secretary of Commerce to issue policy notices threatening to withhold broadband equity access and deployment or BEAD program funds from any state that refuses to repeal its onerous AI laws.
That is a big stick.
It's huge. These are billions of dollars in critical infrastructure grants earmarked for rural broadband. The federal government is effectively holding state infrastructure funding hostage to force compliance with a deregulatory national standard.
But the defining question for a software engineer is, what exactly makes a state law onerous in the eyes of the DOJ? This is where the legal theory becomes an engineering nightmare.
It really does.
Because the federal push heavily emphasizes what they call the truthful output doctrine. The executive order targets state laws that, according to the administration's interpretation, force AI models to alter, filter, or suppress their natural, statistically truthful outputs to satisfy specific ideological mandates or demographic quotas.
Let us examine the stark contrast by looking at what just happened in Connecticut.
Yeah, let's look at Connecticut.
On May 1st, 2026, Connecticut passed Senate Bill 5, which immediately became one of the most comprehensive and stringent AI laws in the country.
It's massive.
It specifically targets automated employment decision technology, or AEDT. If your software touches hiring, firing, or promotion logic, you are in the crosshairs.
And Connecticut SB 5 includes a clause that I consider the most brutal legal landmine for any SaaS founder.
The liability clause.
Yes. It explicitly states that using a third-party automated system is not a valid defense against a discrimination claim.
Meaning you can't blame the vendor.
Exactly. If you build an HR tech SaaS platform that uses AI to scan resumes, and your AI statistically recommends fewer candidates from a specific demographic group, the employer who bought your software is strictly liable for discrimination.
Right.
And you, as the SaaS developer, are legally mandated to provide the employer with complete, exhaustive transparency data regarding your model's training data and logic weights so they can conduct mandatory bias audits.
Connecticut is demanding an environment of absolute transparency, mandatory pre-decision notifications for all affected job applicants, and strict liability for outcomes.
Which is wild.
It gets even more complex. SB 5 also introduces aggressive whistleblower protections specifically targeted at employees working for frontier developers.
And how do they define a frontier developer?
They define it based on raw compute power.
Yeah.
Specifically, models trained using more than 10 to the 26th power computing operations.
Okay, so the big players.
Right. If an engineer at one of these massive AI labs believes a model poses a catastrophic risk, such as enabling massive financial fraud or physical harm, and they blow the whistle, Connecticut law shields them from retaliation or non-disclosure agreements.
Okay, I want to use a metaphor here to explain the sheer impossibility of the situation for a SaaS developer caught in the middle of this.
Please do.
Let's say you manufacture lenses for glasses. The state of Connecticut passes a law demanding that you must build polarized sunglasses that filter out harsh glare, specifically to protect the user's eyes from damage. If you don't filter the glare, you get sued. But the federal government passes a mandate saying that if you put any tint or polarization on that glass whatsoever, you are illegally distorting the natural reality of the light, violating the truthful output doctrine.
Ah, I see.
You physically cannot manufacture a single piece of glass that satisfies both mandates simultaneously.
The lens metaphor perfectly illustrates the paralyzing reality of dual-track compliance.
Right.
If Connecticut law requires your HR SaaS tool to implement algorithmic filters to ensure demographic parity in resume sorting, but the DOJ litigation task force sues your company, arguing that your parity filter constitutes ideological bias that violates the First Amendment or federal policy, you are trapped.
You're completely stuck.
There is no safe harbor.
So how does a sauce engineering team actually write code today? Do they just guess which side is going to win in the Supreme Court in 3 years?
Guessing is corporate suicide.
That's fair.
The consensus legal advice emerging this week is that SaaS platforms must immediately pivot to building what is known as translucent architecture.
Translucent architecture, okay.
You can no longer rely on neural networks as black boxes where data goes in and decisions come out by magic. You have to engineer your systems to meticulously log and export the exact decision tree, the weighted logic, and the training data rationale for every single output your AI generates.
So you need the receipts.
You have to build the capability to prove exactly how the AI arrived at a conclusion, step by step. That way, whether you are defending yourself against a state auditor looking for demographic bias or a federal investigator looking for artificial filtering, you have the mathematical receipts to defend your architecture.
That sounds incredibly expensive to build.
It is a massive engineering overhead.
But if you think navigating the U.S. federal-state paradox is complex, we need to turn our attention abroad. Because if the U.S. is a confusing legal tug-of-war, the European Union is a rapidly ticking time bomb with devastatingly clear, unavoidable penalties.
The EU is not messing around.
No, they are not. If you are building translucent architecture to survive the U.S. market, wait until you hear what Europe requires. Let's break down the EU AI Act's 90-day countdown.
As we record this in early May 2026, the global tech industry is exactly 90 days away from August 2, 2026.
The big day.
This date marks the primary application of the vast majority of the EU AI Act's operational rules. Without hyperbole, this is the most significant disruptive compliance event for the global software ecosystem since the rollout of GDPR back in 2018.
And the stakes are existential.
Truly.
We are talking about maximum penalties that can reach up to 35 million euros, or 7% of a company's total global annual turnover, whichever is higher. A fine of that magnitude wipes out most mid-market SaaS companies overnight.
It's an instant bankruptcy event.
So what exactly changes when the clock strikes midnight on August 2nd?
The most immediate, highly visible technical challenge for any SaaS provider is the activation of the Article 50 transparency mandates.
Okay, what does Article 50 require?
Starting August 2nd, any AI system that interacts directly with human beings or generates synthetic text, audio, image, or video content must be detectable by design.
Detectable by design.
This requires mandatory, indelible watermarking and labeling. You must provide clear, conspicuous, and machine-readable disclosures proving that the content was machine-generated.
I hear people compare the EU AI Act to GDPR constantly, but here's why I think the AI Act is a vastly more difficult engineering problem.
Why?
We just needed a database map. If a user in Germany requested you delete their email address, you queried the database, found the row, and deleted the string of text.
Right, a simple CRUD operation.
Exactly. But AI is non-deterministic. It is infinitely dynamic. An LLM is constantly generating entirely new paragraphs, inferring new connections, hallucinating new concepts. How on earth do you apply a permanent, mathematically secure watermark to an ever-changing stream of generated text without destroying the performance of the model?
The technical difficulty of text watermarking is immense, and frankly, the industry has not perfected it. For images and audio, you can embed cryptographic signals into the metadata or the pixel noise. But for text, watermarking usually involves subtly altering the statistical probability of specific word choices, forcing the model to choose certain synonyms in a recognizable pattern.
Which sounds easy enough.
The problem is that malicious actors can easily run that text through a secondary open-source model to rewrite it, completely stripping the watermark.
Oh, of course.
Yet the EU mandate doesn't care about the engineering difficulty. The law requires best efforts at detectability by design, and failing to implement an architecture that supports this will trigger enforcement.
And because of how cloud infrastructure works, this isn't just a European problem. Cloud servers, API calls, and edge computing networks are inherently borderless.
Always have been.
If I run a SaaS company out of Austin, Texas, I might have users logging in from Paris or Berlin. Doesn't the EU AI Act essentially become the default global law for any ambitious software company? You can't realistically build one perfectly transparent, watermarked version of your software for Europe and maintain a totally separate, opaque version for the US, right?
We're describing the Brussels effect. The EU AI Act was explicitly drafted with extraterritorial reach.
It covers everything.
It applies across the entire value chain: providers who build the models, deployers who use them, importers and distributors. If your US-based AI software is utilized by a European enterprise client, or if the outputs of your system affect individuals residing in the EU, you are legally in scope.
Wow.
Maintaining bifurcated code bases, one governed and one ungoverned, is a logistical and financial nightmare. Consequently, smart global SaaS companies are simply capitulating and treating the strict EU AI Act as their baseline global engineering standard.
So how are startups supposed to test if their tools comply before they risk a 35 million euro fine? I know the EU is enforcing the creation of AI regulatory sandboxes.
Yes, by the August 2nd deadline, every single member state within the EU must have at least one fully operational AI regulatory sandbox at the national level.
How do those work?
These sandboxes are highly controlled, secure digital environments where companies can deploy and test innovative, high-risk AI systems under the direct, real-time supervision of national regulators before launching them to the open market.
So it's a test bed.
For a SaaS startup, entering a sandbox provides a temporary safe harbor. It allows you to collaborate with the regulator to tweak your algorithms and ensure your product aligns with the Act's safety requirements without the immediate threat of enforcement actions.
Now, I have seen some panic chatter on developer forums about the EU potentially delaying some of these requirements. Is there any truth to that, or is it wishful thinking?
It is a dangerous half-truth.
Okay, explain that.
You are likely referring to the ongoing debates surrounding the EU Digital Omnibus Initiative. There is a legislative proposal circulating in Brussels to potentially defer the application dates for a very specific subset of high-risk AI systems.
Which subset?
Specifically, AI components that are deeply integrated into physical products already covered by existing EU product safety regimes, like medical devices or aviation hardware.
Ah, okay.
The argument is that the harmonized technical standards from the European standardization bodies aren't fully finalized, so they might push that specific compliance date from 2026 into 2027.
But that doesn't help the average software founder.
Not at all. However, the core transparency obligations under Article 50 that affect everyday SaaS platforms and the massive governance rules for general-purpose AI models are non-negotiable and locked in for August 2nd. Any SaaS founder pausing their compliance sprint hoping for a blanket omnibus extension is making a fatal miscalculation.
So, to recap the map so far, the United States is a chaotic legal paradox of federal deregulation colliding with state-level strict liability, and the European Union is a ticking compliance clock threatening massive fines.
That's the landscape.
If you're looking for a break, you have to look elsewhere. The rest of the world isn't just sitting by. We are witnessing the aggressive rise of digital sovereignty.
A very interesting trend.
Different global regions are placing radically different, highly strategic bets on the future of AI to attract capital. Let's examine the massive global divergence playing out right now between Japan, Brazil, and Singapore.
The fragmentation of global AI law is creating an environment ripe for strategic maneuvering. Let us begin with Japan, which has taken perhaps the most aggressive pro-innovation stance in the developed world.
They really have.
In April and May of 2026, the Japanese cabinet officially approved sweeping amendments to the Act on the Protection of Personal Information, or the APPI. In a direct counter-movement to European data privacy norms, Japan explicitly introduced a broad statistical processing exception.
Explain how that statistical processing exception physically works in a cloud architecture. Because on the surface, it sounds like a data harvesting free-for-all.
In a traditional European context under GDPR, if a company wants to train an AI model on a massive data set of human behavior, say billions of customer service chat logs, They generally need explicit opt-in consent from every single individual in that data set.
Which is impossible.
Getting billions of consents is virtually impossible. Japan's APPI amendment circumvents this bottleneck. It legally permits businesses to ingest and use massive datasets containing personal information for the specific purpose of AI model training without obtaining prior individual consent.
Wow. Are there any restrictions?
The only technical requirement is that the data must be rendered non-identifying through pseudonymization, and the developer must demonstrate that the processing poses a low risk to individual rights. They have essentially legalized mass data ingestion for machine learning.
The business implications of that are staggering.
They really are.
Because if I am a global SaaS company building a next-generation predictive AI, and I am entirely blocked from training my model on European data because of the EU AI Act, and I'm paralyzed in the US by state-level privacy lawsuits, I can just route my massive data pipelines through cloud servers physically located in Tokyo.
Yes, you can.
I exploit their favorable statistical processing exception, compute and train the neural network weights there, package the finished compiled model, and then deploy it globally as a finished product.
Exactly what you just described is known as regulatory arbitrage,
Yeah.
and it is happening at an industrial scale. Major tech firms are currently standing up massive data processing centers in Japan, specifically to leverage this permissive legal framework. Japan is actively positioning its jurisdiction as a safe haven for global AI research and development.
But then you fly across the globe to Brazil, and the legal environment completely inverts again.
Correct. Brazil is currently finalizing Bill 2338, which is heavily inspired by the European model.
They went the other direction.
They did. It closely mirrors the strict risk-based categorization of the EU AI Act. Brazil's legislation mandates rigorous algorithmic impact assessments before high-risk models can be deployed, and critically, it requires all AI systems to be registered in a publicly accessible government database.
So no flying under the radar.
If your SaaS platform targets the Latin American market, you are essentially dealing with an EU-style compliance burden, complete with mandatory transparency and state oversight.
But of all the international frameworks, the one that I think is the most forward-looking and frankly the most urgent for the tech industry to understand is coming out of Singapore.
Singapore's approach is fascinating.
Because while the EU and Brazil are busy regulating chatbots that generate text, Singapore realizes the technology has already evolved, and they're looking down the barrel of agentic AI.
Singapore's introduction of the Model AI Governance Framework for Agentic AI in early 2026 is a masterclass in anticipating the threat vector.
It really is.
The commercial software industry is rapidly evolving past simple generative AI models that wait for a prompt, draft an email, and stop. The massive capital push is toward agentic AI.
And what's the core difference for the listener?
An AI agent does not just answer a question. It is given a high-level goal, and it autonomously plans out a multi-step sequence of actions across various software systems to achieve that goal. You can read emails, update CRM databases, execute financial payments, and send calendar invites without any human intervention.
Let's update an analogy to really capture the risk here.
Right.
Early generative AI was like having a smart but completely stationary intern. You hand them a piece of paper, they write a summary, and they hand it back.
Exactly.
Agentic AI is like hiring a hyper-competent insomniac intern, giving them the master admin password to your entire corporate database, handing them a limitless corporate credit card, and telling them to optimize the supply chain.
That is a terrifying intern.
Right. Sure, they might do a month's worth of brilliant work in 3 seconds, but because they execute actions at machine speed, they could also accidentally initiate 10,000 unauthorized refunds and bankrupt the company before you can even hit the refresh button on your dashboard. Singapore is recognizing that we desperately need strict rules for the insomniac intern.
It is the speed and autonomy of the execution that fundamentally changes the risk profile. Because AI agents act directly upon their digital environment, they introduce entirely new classes of enterprise risk.
Like what?
We were talking about unauthorized catastrophic actions, rapid privilege escalation where an agent tricks another system into giving it more access, and cascading errors where one bad automated decision triggers a chain reaction across an entire financial network.
Right.
Singapore's framework demands that developers mathematically bound these risks up front. You are required to hard-code limitations on an agent's operational autonomy. Furthermore, the framework mandates strict, meaningful human accountability.
What does that mean technically?
Meaning, developers must design workflows with mandatory, unbypassable checkpoints, where a human being must review and approve the agent's logic before a critical action is executed.
I have to push back on the legal reality of that, though. How do we actually enforce accountability when an AI is writing its own multi-step to-do list in a fraction of a second?
That's the challenge.
Let's say I approve step 1 of an agent's plan, but at step 4, the agent dynamically decides to do something illegal, like scraping copyrighted data or executing a predatory trade based on new information it found at step 3. Who is legally responsible? Me, the human who clicked go on step 1 without knowing what step 4 would be.
That is the defining legal conundrum of agentic AI, and is precisely why Singapore's framework insists that human oversight cannot be an afterthought.
Okay.
The framework dictates that there must be a clear, legally binding allocation of responsibilities between the developer of the agent and the deployer using it. For SaaS providers, the implication is massive. You can no longer simply sell access to an autonomous agent.
You have to sell the whole package.
You must build and sell the complex governance scaffolding surrounding it. Your product must feature deep audit logs, real-time intervention dashboards, and mechanisms to instantly kill-switch an agent if it deviates from its bounded parameters.
Okay, we have thoroughly mapped the global regulatory minefield. We have the sheer terror of federal vetting in the U.S., strict liability bias traps at the state level, the ticking EU AI Act countdown, regulatory arbitrage in Japan, and the absolute necessity of agent control in Singapore.
It's a lot.
Let's make this intensely practical. What does a SaaS founder, an enterprise procurement buyer, or a lead software engineer actually do when they log into work on Monday to survive 2026? Let's open up the SaaS Survival Guide.
The overarching architectural theme for the SaaS industry in 2026 is a massive reallocation of engineering resources.
Where are they putting the resources?
The era of prioritizing feature velocity racing to staple a new AI chatbot onto your product every week is completely over. The mandate for 2026 is the infrastructure rebuild.
Back to the foundation.
Enterprise budgets have radically shifted away from experimenting with flashy generative AI demos toward proving AI readiness, security, and operability.
Because the enterprise market has realized that plugging an LLM into a messy corporate database is basically a self-inflicted data breach.
It is a disaster waiting to happen.
There is a terrifying statistic circulating this year. 97% of companies report experiencing internal AI security incidents directly tied to insufficient access controls. 97%.
The mechanism behind that 97% failure rate is straightforward. If you implement an enterprise search AI and point it at your company's internal data lake, the AI will dutifully index everything.
And it reads everything fast.
Right. If your underlying data architecture lacks strict granular permission controls, the AI will happily surface confidential HR salary data, unreleased financial projections, and proprietary source code to any entry-level employee who asks the right question. The AI simply bypasses the clunky legacy interfaces that used to obscure that data. That is why SaaS organizational charts are fundamentally reorganizing this year. Companies are disbanding their isolated AI feature squads and rapidly expanding their data platform teams, integration engineers, and workflow orchestration specialists.
Let's ground this in a specific high-stakes vertical to show just how dangerous this gets if you ignore the rules. Let's look at healthcare SaaS, specifically tools handling prior authorization and claims review.
A perfect example.
This is a massive, multi-billion-dollar segment of the software industry. Right now, health insurers are buying SaaS platforms that use AI to automatically scan and deny patient medical claims in bulk, citing lack of medical necessity.
Yes.
On the exact opposite side of the battlefield, hospitals and patients are using AI tools to automatically generate massive, complex medical appeals to fight those denials. It's literally an algorithmic arms race, AI fighting AI.
And that arms race is currently collapsing under the weight of massive class action litigation. Patients and medical providers are suing major insurers, alleging that their algorithmic tools are automatically denying critical care without any individual human clinical review.
And the feds are getting involved.
The federal government is stepping in aggressively. The Department of Labor recently targeted a major third-party administrator for utilizing an automated system to bulk deny thousands of claims. The core legal issue here relies on ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act.
Explain the ERISA angle for the SaaS vendors listening who don't have a law degree. Why does a federal retirement and health plan law suddenly apply to their software code base?
Under ERISA, employers who sponsor health plans for their employees hold a strict fiduciary duty. They are legally required to act solely in the best interest of the plan participants.
Okay, that makes sense.
Courts and regulators are increasingly ruling that this fiduciary duty extends to monitoring the algorithms of third-party vendors. If an employer purchases your healthcare SaaS platform and your AI system wrongly or systematically denies claims without proper clinical oversight, the employer can be held liable for a breach of fiduciary duty.
So they're taking the heat for your bad software.
Exactly. If your software exposes your enterprise clients to immense fiduciary liability, your software will be ripped out of their tech stack immediately.
So how do you practically prove to an enterprise buyer that your SaaS isn't going to get them sued by the Department of Labor? How do you prove your system is safe?
You must adopt and certify against globally recognized, standardized frameworks. The industry is rapidly coalescing around the ISO/IE 42001 standard. It is the world's first comprehensive management system standard, specifically designed for artificial intelligence.
I hear people calling it the SOC2 for AI. Is that an accurate comparison?
It is an excellent conceptual bridge. SOC2 became the absolute gold standard for cloud computing. If you didn't have a SOC2 audit report, you couldn't sell cloud software to an enterprise.
Right, it was the ticket to entry.
SOC2 proved you kept data secure. ISO 42001 operates similarly, but it goes beyond data security to examine the logic and governance of the AI itself. It provides an auditable framework proving to buyers that your AI system undergoes continuous risk assessment, that its decision-making parameters are documented, and that you have established clear mechanisms for human oversight and continuous monitoring.
And securing those certifications and building the translucent architecture we discussed earlier is totally changing the fundamental economics of the software business.
It's changing the pricing models.
Exactly. The traditional SaaS business model for the last 20 years was seat-based pricing. You pay $50 a month for every human user who logs into the platform.
The standard per-user license.
But agentic AI breaks that model entirely because AI agents don't need seats. A single agent can do the workflow of 50 human users in the background. So we're seeing the massive rise of agentic enterprise license agreements, or AELAs.
Yes.
SaaS is rapidly transitioning to outcome-based pricing. The customer doesn't pay for the software login, they pay for the successful resolution of a support ticket or the successful processing of an invoice.
The pivot to outcome-based pricing is brilliant from a revenue perspective, but it carries a critical, often overlooked legal implication.
What's that?
If a SaaS company fundamentally changes its business model to charge for a specific outcome rather than access to a tool, they're implicitly guaranteeing the safety, compliance, and accuracy of that outcome.
Oh, wow.
You are no longer just providing a word processor, you are providing the finalized legal document. Consequently, the SaaS provider's liability footprint expands massively. You are taking on the operational risk of the task itself.
Which leads me to a foundational, almost philosophical business question.
Okay, let's hear it.
If the new survival mandate for a SaaS company requires endless third-party audits, massive infrastructure rebuilds to comply with the EU AI Act, deep pockets to survive federal vetting delays, and assuming direct liability for business outcomes under new pricing models, does this officially kill the two founders in a garage startup dream? Is AI innovation now exclusively a big-budget, heavily lawyered corporate game? Because it sounds to me like you need a $3 million legal and compliance budget just to launch a beta product today.
It undeniably raises the barrier to entry to levels we haven't seen since the early days of hardware manufacturing.
That's a high barrier.
The mythological two founders in a garage model will survive, but its nature will fundamentally shift. Those founders will no longer be able to build foundational AI infrastructure or untethered agents from scratch.
So what do they build?
They will be forced to build strictly on top of heavily governed, pre-certified platforms. They will have to leverage API providers who have already absorbed the massive capital costs of federal vetting, EU compliance, and ISO certification. The raw innovation will migrate entirely to the highly specialized application layer, while the underlying AI models and orchestration engines become heavily regulated, monolithic public utilities.
It is a fundamentally different world. So with billions of dollars in infrastructure, global compliance costs, and absolute national security on the line, how do governments and institutional investors actually keep score? Who is winning the AI arms race during this supercycle?
We need metrics.
That brings us to our final analytical segment, measuring the madness with the OECD.AI Index.
In an environment moving this rapidly, governments, policymakers, and venture capital firms desperately need robust, comparable, and empirical metrics to assess the health and competitiveness of national AI ecosystems. To address this critical need, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development officially published the OECD.AI Index in 2026.
Which is a huge undertaking.
It is a highly sophisticated composite measurement framework.
And for the SaaS founders listening, this isn't just academic trivia. If you are deciding whether to incorporate your startup in London, Toronto, or Tokyo, or figuring out where the deepest talent pools for compliance engineering exist, this index is your map.
It absolutely is.
But it's not just a single blunt score measuring who has the biggest supercomputer, right?
Far from it. The OECD.AI Index integrates 28 distinct AI-specific indicators categorized across 5 core components.
What are the components?
It measures AI research and development, the strength of AI-enabling infrastructure like compute availability, the maturity of the AI policy environment, including the existence of regulatory sandboxes, the state of jobs and skills within the workforce, and the level of international cooperation.
So it's very comprehensive.
Extremely. It aggregates data from official government statistics, administrative records, and even scrapes GitHub repository commits to measure the vitality of a nation's open-source ecosystem.
And importantly, the scores, which range from 0.17 to 2.66, are calculated on a per capita basis. This allows for fair, balanced comparisons between small, highly innovative nations and massive economies.
Exactly.
But I have to challenge the fundamental premise of an index like this. I compare creating a static AI index in 2026 to trying to map the topography of a continent while you're standing in the middle of a massive magnitude 9 earthquake.
That's a vivid image.
The underlying technology, as we saw with Mythos, fundamentally rewrites the rules of the possible every few months. The international regulations change weekly. How reliable can these 28 metrics actually be when the ground under them is moving at machine speed?
It is a highly valid critique of any statistical framework in this sector. The OECD anticipates this volatility by designing the index to be explicitly modular.
Modular, meaning it can adapt.
It does not claim to predict the future trajectory of the technology. Rather, it provides an evidence-based baseline that captures a snapshot in time, allowing new metrics to be seamlessly integrated as they become available. For instance, it doesn't just measure a raw computing power, it measures the institutional presence of regulatory sandboxes, the implementation of trustworthy AI principles, and government adoption of AI tools.
So it's about the ecosystem's resilience.
Exactly. It provides policymakers and investors with a critical dashboard to identify structural weaknesses in their ecosystem, ensuring they have the governance foundations in place to handle whatever technological earthquake comes next.
Okay, let's take a deep breath and synthesize this massive journey for everyone listening. We started by examining Anthropic's Mythos, which shattered our assumptions by proving that AI can autonomously hack secure legacy infrastructure.
A true inflection point.
That specific terror forced the U.S. government to abandon its deregulatory stance and propose a massive FDA for algorithms vetting system. Simultaneously, the federal DOJ is utilizing funding threats to battle state laws like Connecticut's SB 5, which imposes strict liability and demands algorithmic transparency for hiring tools.
The dual-track compliance nightmare.
Right. And across the Atlantic, the EU AI Act's 90-day countdown is acting as a global forcing function, demanding that SaaS companies immediately implement deep architectural transparency and watermarking or face existential €35 million fines.
The Brussels effect in action.
Meanwhile, nations like Japan are creating beta havens to attract R&D, while Singapore is actively building the guardrails for the hyper-competent insomniac interns known as agentic AI. All of this combined is forcing smart, surviving SaaS companies to completely abandon the duct tape, move fast, and break things mentality. The new mandate is reorganizing your entire engineering culture around data governance, workflow orchestration, and outcome-based pricing, all while mathematically proving your safety through rigorous standards like ISO 42001.
The signal cutting through the noise of this supercycle is absolute. Regulatory compliance is no longer an administrative afterthought handled by legal teams post-launch. Compliance is now a fundamental foundational product requirement that dictates market access, enterprise trust, and ultimate viability.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you to mull over as you navigate this new reality. We spent a lot of time discussing agentic AI software that can autonomously reason, plan, and execute multi-step actions across the internet.
Yes.
Consider a future scenario where an autonomous AI agent, optimizing for a specific business metric, commits massive cascading financial fraud, or worse, triggers a failure that causes physical harm.
It's a very real possibility.
Yeah. Look at the complex ecosystem involved. You have a massive foundational model developer like Anthropic who built the base reasoning engine. You have a mid-market SaaS deployer who fine-tuned the model and built the user interface. You have the enterprise client who paid for the outcome. And you have the AI itself making unprompted dynamic decisions at machine speed.
So many moving parts.
When the dust settles and the damage is done, who actually goes to jail?
The chain of liability in that scenario is entirely untested in modern jurisprudence.
Will we eventually reach a point where the legal framework evolves so radically that an algorithm itself is literally put on trial in a digital courtroom?
Wow.
Could we see a future form of digital capital punishment where a judge orders a specific, highly advanced model to be permanently cryptographically deleted from all servers as a penalty for its actions? I want you to really think about what human justice looks like in a fully automated world.
That is something to keep you awake at night.
So, as you log off and head back to building your software, remember the race car in the garage. The days of just strapping on an engine, ignoring the missing bolts, and flooring it onto the public streets are permanently over. The inspectors have arrived, and they have badges.
Time to build for the inspection.
It's time to learn how to build for the inspection. Because in the 2026 regulatory supercycle, the only thing worse than driving a slow car is building one that's not legally allowed on the track. Thanks for diving deep with us today.